Two people, two worlds. One rain-soaked bus in the middle of Chicago. She is invisible by necessity, a woman who has learned to take up as little space as possible, to move through the city without being noticed, to survive by staying quiet. He is invisible by design, a man whose power depends on being underestimated, who chose an empty bus on a rainy Tuesday night, specifically because no one would think to look for him there. Amara Bennett boards the number 22 line at 11:47 p.m. with aching feet, a wet coat, and exactly $4.16 to her name. Kang Minjai is already seated in the back, watching the city blur past the glass, when the last woman who will ever surprise him steps through the door. Neither of them knows what the next 40 minutes will cost. Neither of them knows that the life they had before this bus ride is already over. One truth, two perspectives, and a single moment that will stop the world. The rain had been falling since 6 o'clock, which meant Amara's shoes had been wet for 5 hours. She didn't think about it anymore. Wet shoes were just wet shoes. Same category as cold fingers, an empty stomach, and the particular exhaustion that lived behind her eyes after a double shift. You acknowledged it. Then you kept moving, because standing still and feeling sorry for yourself was a luxury she'd long since stopped affording. The number 22 bus hissed to a stop under the Lawrence Avenue overpass, and Amara stepped on with her head ducked against the wind, dropping her fare with the practiced motion of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. The driver barely glanced at her. She barely glanced at him. This was the beautiful anonymous rhythm of public transit. No one owed anyone eye contact. She moved down the aisle and chose a seat near the middle, close enough to the door that she could exit quickly, far enough from the front that the driver's radio didn't buzz against her skull. The bus was nearly empty. A woman in scrubs dozed near the window. An older man in a bear's jacket sat reading something on his phone. And in the very back, Amara didn't look long. She just registered. Man, dark jacket, alone, head down. Then she turned away and pulled out her earbuds. Azay's voice filled her ears, and for a moment, just a moment, the wet shoes and the aching back and the $4.16 stopped being real. She thought about her sister's birthday in 3 weeks, and whether the money from the cleaning contract would clear in time. She thought about the community college catalog she'd been reading on her lunch break, the accounting program that cost more per semester than she made in 2 months. She thought about her mother's voice on the phone last Sunday. "You sound tired, baby." "You always sound tired." "I'm fine, Mama." The answer she always gave. The answer that meant, "Please don't worry. Please don't add your worry to everything I'm already carrying." The bus lurched forward into the rain. Amara leaned her head against the cold glass and watched the city move past, the yellow smear of a bodega sign, the red blur of a traffic light, a man jogging under a broken umbrella that had given up its fight against the wind. Chicago in November was a lesson in endurance. You either made peace with the cold or it broke you. She had made peace. She was almost asleep when the bus shuddered to a stop 3 blocks before her transfer point. Her eyes opened. Through the rain-streaked window, she saw a dark SUV parked sideways across the road ahead. Not an accident. The positioning was too deliberate. And then the bus doors were opening, and 3 men in dark clothes were stepping on, and the driver was saying something in a high, nervous voice. And Amara's stomach dropped before her brain had fully caught up. This isn't a robbery. That was her first coherent thought. Robberies looked different, frantic, disorganized. The animal desperation of it always visible. These men moved like they had been trained, like they did this regularly, like they were looking for something specific or someone. She pulled her earbuds out. The men spread through the bus systematically, one toward the front, cutting off the driver, one in the middle, scanning faces with cold efficiency, the third moving toward the back. The woman in scrubs woke up. The man in the bear's jacket went completely still. Amara pressed herself smaller into her seat, a motion so practiced it was almost unconscious. Be invisible, be nobody, be the woman no one notices, when the man in the middle turned and his eyes landed on her. You. He grabbed her arm before she could process the word, yanking her half out of her seat. Move. What? Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. Let go of me. I don't. Move! His grip tightened and fear broke through the surface, cold and metallic in her throat. Let her go. The voice came from the back of the bus. Quiet, controlled, low in register, carrying none of the rough edges of someone performing authority, just the clean, absolute certainty of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. The man holding Amara's arm went very still, and the world for a single strange second seemed to hold its breath with him. The man in the dark jacket rose from the back seat. He moved forward through the narrow aisle with the unhurried precision of someone crossing a room he owned, which Amara would understand later, was how Kang Min-jae moved through every space he entered. He stopped 4 feet away. He looked at the man holding her arm. Something passed between them. Not words, not even gestures. Just a look, a recognition. The grip on her arm disappeared. Min-jae's dark eyes shifted to her then, and Amara felt the full weight of his attention for the first time. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with a lean, sculpted build that his dark jacket couldn't fully conceal. His face was sharp and structured, the kind of face that seemed carved from intention rather than chance. 4 buttons of a white dress shirt lay open beneath the jacket, and along the side of his neck she could see the edge of a tattoo. A dragon, she thought, the scales detailed in black ink. He wasn't looking at her the way the men who had grabbed her had looked at her. He wasn't looking at her like a problem or a pawn. He was looking at her like she was a person. Stay here, he said quietly. With me. And then, before she could respond, he turned his attention to the 3 men who had boarded her bus, and everything changed again. If you want to know what happened next, keep watching. The rain had started 2 blocks after Min-jae told his driver to pull over. He needed to think, and he couldn't think with Young-soo's eyes in the rearview mirror checking on him every 30 seconds, with the SUV's leather and tinted glass creating that sealed, submarine feeling of being transported, rather than moving through the world. He'd survived 3 attempts on his life in the past 18 months. He'd dismantled 2 rival operations with surgical precision. He'd rebuilt his organization's inner circle from nothing after discovering a betrayal that went 4 levels deep. He was not afraid of a bus. He boarded the number 22 with his collar up and his head down. The posture of a man who did not want to be recognized, which was functionally just Min-jae in public. He'd been practicing anonymity since he was 22 years old. He was very good at it. The bus was almost empty. He took the back seat, where he could see the entire car without turning around, and he let himself breathe for the first time in 14 hours. Kim Jae-won. The name rolled through his thoughts with the particular bitterness of betrayal that still surprised him, 4 weeks after the discovery. His oldest lieutenant, his father's choice, the man who had sat beside him at his father's funeral and wept, genuinely wept, and who had been selling his organization's roots to a rival faction for 11 months. The consequences had been handled. They always were. But Min-jae had not yet handled what the betrayal had done to something quieter inside him, the small protected part of himself that had still believed in loyalty, in Jong, in the kind of bond that was supposed to be unbreakable. He stared out the rain-struck window and thought about his mother in Incheon, who still believed he ran an import business. He thought about his younger brother at Northwestern, studying architecture with the focused ambition that Min-jae had redirected his own life away from at 19. He thought about the organization that bore his family's name and the weight of it, which had seemed manageable when his father was alive and now sometimes felt like something that would eventually crush him. He was not a man given to self-pity. He noticed the woman when she boarded. He couldn't have explained why exactly, except that she moved differently from the other passengers, not timidly, not aggressively, but with the quiet, contained energy of someone who had made serious peace with their circumstances. She chose her seat with the instinct of someone who had thought about safety in public spaces. She pulled out her earbuds and closed her eyes, and something in the line of her shoulders told him she was exhausted in the bone-deep way that required more than a single night of sleep to resolve. He looked away. He was not on this bus to notice women. He was thinking about loyalty and betrayal and the particular loneliness of power when the SUV parked sideways across Lawrence Avenue, and he recognized immediately what was happening. His pulse stayed even. This was training, years of it, the ability to process threat and respond without the biological panic response that got people killed. He catalogued the men as they boarded. 3, armed but not displaying weapons, professional in their movement, not random criminals, sent. He identified their target within 4 seconds. Not him. Not tonight. This wasn't an assassination setup. The angles were wrong. The positioning was wrong. They were looking for someone else. Then the man in the middle grabbed the woman by the arm, and Min Jae was standing before the decision had fully processed. This surprised him. He wasn't impulsive. Impulsivity was something he'd trained out of himself at considerable cost. But there it was, her arm in that man's grip, her voice steady despite the fear he could read in the set of her jaw, and something in Min Jae simply moved. "Let her go," he said. The man turned, recognized him. Min Jae watched it happen, the sequence of recognition, then recalibration, then the particular blankness that meant someone was deciding how afraid to be. He recognized the man from a faction 2 territories east of his own, street-level muscle, not leadership. They hadn't been sent for him, but they knew exactly who he was. He walked forward until he was 4 feet away and held the man's gaze. And he let the man see what he needed to see, that Min Jae was not concerned, not performing calm, actually calm. The stillness of someone who had stood in far more dangerous rooms than a city bus on a Tuesday night. The grip disappeared from her arm. Min Jae spared one glance for her, then, quick, assessing. She was looking at him with eyes wide and direct. Not the unfocused shock of someone shut down by fear, but the sharp focus of someone trying to understand what was happening. Her skin was deep, warm brown, catching the fluorescent light of the bus interior. Her hair was pulled up with a few coils escaping at the temples. She had a small scar near her left eyebrow that he noticed without meaning to. "Stay here," he said, "with me." Then he turned to handle what needed to be handled. He spoke quietly. He made certain references. He watched the calculation happen behind the man's eyes, the weighing of whatever they'd been sent to do against the considerably larger problem of being on the wrong side of Kang Min Jae. They left. The bus doors closed. The driver, white-knuckled, accelerated without being asked. Min Jae turned back and found her still watching him, still that same focused, direct attention that asked questions without speaking them. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No." She looked at her arm, then back at him. "Who are you?" A question he hadn't been asked directly in years. Most people who knew enough to ask had already answered it for themselves. He almost said, "Nobody important." The practiced deflection. Instead, he said, "Someone who needed a bus." Her eyes narrowed slightly, and he understood. She was smart, and she knew he was avoiding the question. She'd accepted the deflection for now because she was also practical, and this wasn't the moment for interrogation. But she filed it away. He could see her file it away. And inexplicably, for no reason he could have defended rationally. He was glad. What happens when 2 worlds collide? Stay with us. 3 days later, Amara was still thinking about the bus. Specifically, she was thinking about the way he'd said, "Stay here with me," not as a command, but as something quieter, something that had felt more like a request, dressed in the syntax of certainty. She had thought about it while mopping the east corridor of the Millennium Park underground lot at 1 a.m. She had thought about it while making rice and leftover collard greens in her apartment on Wednesday evening. She had thought about it on Thursday morning when she was supposed to be reading the lease renewal for her building and found herself reading the same paragraph 4 times. She'd told her cousin Danielle about it, a truncated version, leaving out the men and the SUV and the particular controlled authority of the man who had cleared them from the bus like someone removing clutter from a table he needed to use. "A man on the bus said, 'Stay with me'?" Danielle had repeated, delighted. "Amara, Amara. Girl, what are you doing here instead of back on that bus?" It wasn't like that, though Amara couldn't entirely explain what it had been like. He was... She stopped. Dangerous felt too simple. Powerful felt too abstract. "He seemed like someone you shouldn't know," she finally said. Danielle had given her the look she reserved for times when Amara said something technically true and entirely beside the point. Amara had not gone back to the number 22 bus. She had, however, thought about him with an honesty she didn't entirely endorse. The tallness of him, yes. She had always noticed height, but more than that, the way he moved through the bus as though the physical space conformed to him rather than the other way around. The 4 open buttons of that white shirt, the tattoo at his neck, the hands. She'd noticed the hands when he'd guided her back to her seat after the men left. Barely a touch, just the lightest pressure of his palm against her shoulder blade, but she'd catalogued it anyway because her body apparently had opinions about his hands. She was not going to do anything about these observations. She was 27 years old. She had 6 months of back debt on her student loans, and she had learned enough about herself over the years to know that she was the kind of woman who fell hard for the wrong people and then spent considerable time recovering. She was not falling for a stranger on a bus who had scared 3 armed men off with a look. That would be idiotic. She was thinking this exact thought on Friday night when she walked out of the loading dock of the restaurant where she'd picked up a weekend cleaning shift and nearly collided with a man leaning against the building's exterior wall. Min Jae. Different clothes, a dark coat over that same white shirt, sleeves cuffed, the collar open as before, the dragon tattoo visible at his neck. He straightened when he saw her, which in itself was unusual. Most men she knew performed indifference. He simply adjusted to her presence. "You work here," he said. Not a question, observation. Her first instinct was alarm. How does he know where I work? And her second instinct, arriving immediately on its heels, was the strange recognition that if this man had wanted to find her, finding her would not have been difficult. He had known which bus she took. He had known she realized things about her circumstance just from watching her for one bus ride. That should have been frightening. Somehow it wasn't. "Do you have a reason for being outside my workplace?" she asked instead, because her mother had raised her to ask clear questions when she needed clear answers. Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Amusement, she thought, quickly contained. "I wanted to know you were all right," he said. "The men from the bus, they were looking for someone specific. I needed to be certain they weren't—" He stopped, chose words carefully. "That the situation hadn't followed you." Amara studied him in the yellow sodium light of the parking lot. He was watching her with that same quality of attention she'd noticed on the bus, focused but not aggressive, like someone who was genuinely trying to read her, not perform interest for an outcome. "You checked on me," she said. "Yes." "That's—" She tried to land on a word. "That's a strange thing to do." "Perhaps." He didn't apologize for it. "Are you all right?" She thought about the last 3 days. The aching feet, the loan notices, the 4 times read lease paragraph, the collard greens reheated for the 3rd meal in a row. She thought about her mother's voice. "You sound tired, baby." "I'm fine," she said. The answer she always gave. His eyes stayed on hers for a moment, and she had the uncomfortable sensation that he had heard everything she hadn't said. "I'd like to speak with you," he said, "if you're willing, not here." She should have said no. She knew all the reasons to say no. "Give me 20 minutes to finish my shift," she said instead. And the corner of his mouth moved again, and this time she saw it clearly. Not a smirk, but something softer, something that looked on that contained and careful face, very much like relief. Is Amara walking into something she can't walk back from? Don't go anywhere. The problem with Amara Bennett was that she didn't behave the way people behaved around him. Most people, when they understood, even partially who Minjai was, organized themselves around that understanding. They became either deferential or hostile, either trying to please him or trying to position themselves advantageously against him. Both responses were legible. Both were things he knew how to navigate. Amara asked clear questions and then watched his answers with the careful attention of someone assessing honesty rather than performing belief. She said exactly what she meant. And when he was evasive, which he was often because there was no version of full transparency available to him, she noted the evasion without becoming angry about it. "That's a strange thing to do," she'd said about him checking on her, and the observation had been accurate, and she'd let it be accurate without weaponizing it. He had spent the 20 minutes of her closing shift sitting in a coffee shop on Michigan Avenue, trying to construct a reasonable explanation for why he'd looked up the cleaning contracts associated with her building and cross-referenced them with Friday night restaurant schedules in a 5-block radius. No reasonable explanation had presented itself. The unreasonable one, that she'd been in his head for 3 days with a persistence that was unprecedented in his adult life, he was not ready to examine. She came out of the restaurant still in her work clothes, dark pants and a grey Henley, her natural hair pulled back, and he rose when he saw her because his mother had raised him to, regardless of circumstance. She noticed. He could see her noticing. He took her to a restaurant on Wacker Drive that he partially owned, not to impress her, but because it was the one space in Chicago where he could speak freely and be certain no one would report the conversation. He had explained only that it was a place he trusted, and she had accepted this the way she seemed to accept most things, with a considering look and then practical accommodation. Over bibimbap, and for her, a plate of short ribs with sides she'd chosen, with the focused pleasure of someone eating a proper meal after a long time of making do with less. She had asked him actual questions. Not "what do you do?" She'd clearly already understood enough to know that question had no safe answer. But why were those men looking for someone on a bus? And is it resolved, and are you in danger? The last question had given him pause. In his experience, people did not ask if he was in danger. They asked if they themselves were in danger. They made the calculation about their own exposure and acted accordingly. She'd asked about him. "It's managed," he said carefully. "That's not the same as resolved." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She'd looked at him then with those direct eyes, and he'd made a decision that was either very sound or very unsound. He still hadn't decided which, and told her slightly more truth than he usually offered anyone. Not much, just enough. Jong, his grandmother had called it, when he was a boy in Busan, asking why people fell for each other. Not love, not attraction. Something more like the slow, inevitable accumulation of connection, the way people grew onto each other like vines, until the idea of separation required tearing something away. "You cannot always choose when it starts," she'd said. "You can only decide what to do once it has." He had not thought about his grandmother's explanation of Jong in 15 years. He thought about it now, sitting across from a woman he'd known for 4 days, watching her eat his food with the particular ease of someone who was hungry and didn't plan to pretend otherwise, and understanding with a clarity that was almost inconvenient that something had begun. He drove her home afterward. She lived in Logan Square, a 3rd-floor walk-up with a buzzing security light, and she thanked him for dinner with the composed courtesy of someone who would not be performing gratitude. "You could have just had your people check on me," she said at her door. "You didn't have to come yourself." He had not asked how she'd deduced he had people. She had, and the deduction was correct. No, he agreed. I didn't. She looked at him for a moment. That means something, she said. I'm not sure what, but it means something. He didn't answer because there was nothing to add. She was correct. After she went inside, he stood on the sidewalk for longer than he needed to, then called young Sue to bring the car. Young Sue, to his credit, asked nothing. Minjai sat in the back seat as the city moved past and thought about a woman who asked if he was in danger, and who looked at his evasions with clear eyes and chose to stay anyway, and who had said, I'm not sure what it means, with the precision of someone who would, in time, be very sure indeed. The problem with Amara Bennett was not actually a problem. That was, perhaps, the most alarming thing of all. Two people standing at the edge of something enormous. What happens when they step forward? Don't stop now. 3 weeks passed. Amara did not tell herself a story about what was happening. She had grown up watching women she loved tell themselves stories. He's different. He'll change. This is just complicated. Once things settled down, and she had made a private promise at 19 that she would try to see things as they were, rather than as she needed them to be. What things were? Minjay texted with the clean economy of someone who chose words like, he chose actions, deliberately, sparingly, with no waste. Dinner Thursday if you're free. Not a question exactly, but not a demand either. There was always the implicit space for no. She said yes on Thursdays, sometimes Saturdays. Once, on a Tuesday night when she was too tired to cook and too wired to sleep, she'd texted him first, and the 40 seconds before his response had been the longest 40 seconds of her recent memory, and when he'd replied, I'll come to you. 30 minutes. She'd stood in her kitchen with her phone against her chest and breathed. What things also were. He was not a safe person. She'd understood this from the bus and had filed it clearly, refusing to let the dinners and the texts and the way he made space at his table blur the underlying reality. She knew enough to know she didn't know enough. She knew that the people who worked for him moved through rooms the way soldiers moved, always positioned, always aware. She knew that when his phone rang and he stepped away from the table to take the call, he came back a different kind of quiet. She knew that the dragon tattoo at his neck was not decorative. She asked him once, on a Saturday in December when the lake was the color of iron and they'd walked along the river walk, because she'd wanted cold air, and he'd wanted, she suspected, to just be somewhere that wasn't a room with walls. Does it end? Can it end? He'd been quiet for a long time, then, I don't know. She'd nodded. She'd appreciated more than she could have explained that he hadn't said yes. For Minjay, those 3 weeks were a kind of controlled dismantling. His second-in-command, Park Suhan, who had served alongside him for 8 years and was the kind of loyal that required no testing, noticed first. He said nothing directly because Suhan had the cultural fluency to understand that direct confrontation of Minjay's internal states was not a road that ended well. But he stopped scheduling Saturday evening calls. He rearranged the Thursday timetable without being asked. He provided these courtesies with a studied neutrality that was itself a form of commentary. Minjay noticed, acknowledged it with nothing more than the absence of objection. He had told Amara gradually over the course of those weeks, more truth than he'd told any person outside his organization in a decade. Not everything. There was no version of everything that could exist between them safely, but pieces. His father's death and what it had required of him. The betrayal, without names or specifics, but the shape of it. The particular devastation of discovering corruption in someone you'd chosen to trust. His brother in Evanston, who thought he ran a legitimate enterprise, who Minjay had protected from the truth for 6 years, with the same ferocity he protected everything he loved. In return, she'd given him pieces of herself that he suspected she shared with very few people. The student loans, the community college catalogue she'd finally applied to. Her mother in Champagne, who didn't know how bad the finances had gotten, because Amara's pride was structural, load-bearing, and she had not yet figured out how to dismantle it without the whole thing collapsing. The sister's birthday she'd funded by selling a gold bracelet on Facebook Marketplace and felt no regret about. He had wanted, when she told him that, to simply resolve the financial situation in the way things got resolved in his world, cleanly, completely, without ceremony. He had understood, without needing to be told, that this would be catastrophic, that Amara's independence was not a character quirk, but a carefully constructed architecture of dignity, built by a woman who'd had to fight for every beam of it. So instead, he'd said, "The accounting program, is it the right one?" She'd blinked. "What? At the college? Is it accredited? Is there a better program somewhere else in the city?" She'd stared at him for a long moment, long enough that he'd thought he'd miscalculated. Then, "No one's ever asked me that before." He'd said nothing, let the silence hold what it needed to. Then she'd talked about the program for 45 minutes, with a contained, careful passion that made something in his chest do something undignified. And she'd ended by saying, almost to herself, "I keep thinking I'll wait until things are more stable. But things haven't been stable in 4 years, so maybe that's not actually the plan. Maybe that's just the reason I keep giving myself." He'd looked at her across the table, then stopped giving it. She'd looked back at him, and something had shifted, not dramatically, not the cinematic moment of realization, but the quiet, tectonic kind, the shift that had been coming for weeks and had simply finally arrived. She'd said, "You make me want to stop being careful." And he'd said, "I'm not asking you to stop being careful. I'm asking you to let someone be careful with you." The silence after that was long and full, and neither of them broke it right away, because some moments need room. Then she'd said, "Okay," and it was the smallest word and the largest commitment, and she'd meant it entirely. They were standing at the precipice of something that had no clean edges, no safe map, no guarantee of safe passage through it. His world did not accommodate innocence. Her life did not accommodate recklessness. These were not problems that disappeared because two people wanted each other. But she had looked at his world with clear eyes and not flinched, and he had looked at her life and seen not a problem to solve, but a person to stand beside. His phone rang. The specific ringtone, 3 short, 2 long, that meant Park Soo-han, which meant the situation that had been brewing for 10 days in the Western Territory had reached a point that required Min Jae's presence. Now. Tonight. He looked at the screen. Then he looked at her. She read his face with the fluency she'd been developing over 3 weeks. "Go," she said quietly. "I'll explain." "Go." Not angry, not hurt. "Explain later." He stood. Then, because she had said okay and because she was looking at him with those clear, decided eyes, he did something he had not done in years without calculation behind it. He touched her face. Just his hand at her jaw, his thumb at the corner of her mouth, brief and certain. She went very still. He went very still. Then he left, because he had to, and she sat with the warmth of his hand against her skin, and the knowledge that she had just said okay to something that had no map. And in the car, moving west through the night-wet city, Min Jae's hand on his phone, and Soo-han's voice in his ear, and the immediate pressing reality of his world closing around him again. He was thinking about her kitchen, and the accounting catalogue, and the way she said okay like she meant it with her whole body. He was thinking that the next conversation would require him to show her more truth than he had yet shown anyone. He was thinking that he was going to have it anyway. He was thinking that something had started on a rain-soaked bus at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that he had not chosen and could not stop and did not, for the first time in a very long time, want to. The city blurred past. The rain was starting again, and somewhere in Logan Square, Amara Bennett was sitting with her hands folded on a restaurant table, looking at the space he'd left behind, deciding something she'd already decided. She opened her phone. She navigated to the community college portal. She submitted the application. The story isn't over. Some things are just beginning. 2 days later, Amara got her acceptance email at 7:43 a.m. while waiting for the number 22 bus. She read it 3 times. Then she sat down on the bench under the stop shelter, even though the bus was 2 minutes away because her legs had gone unreliable. She'd been accepted. Spring semester, the accounting program, the exact one. She thought about all the years she'd told herself. Later, when things are more stable, when you're not so tired, when you can afford the risk of wanting something. She thought about the woman she'd been 3 weeks ago, boarding a night bus with wet shoes and $4.16, certain that the best she could do was keep her head down and survive. She thought about a quiet voice saying, "Stay here with me," and how nothing had been the same since. Her phone buzzed. Minjai. "There are things I need you to know before we go further." Her chest tightened, not with fear, exactly, with the acute awareness of a moment with weight. She looked up at the grey Chicago sky and thought about clear eyes and deliberate choices and the particular courage of stepping towards something that didn't come with a guarantee. She typed back, "Amara, I know. Tell me." The number 22 arrived. She boarded it, sat down near the middle, and watched the city move past with her phone in her hands and her heart doing something complicated in her future, for the first time in years, feeling like something that was actually hers. 3 dots appeared on the screen, then disappeared, then appeared again. She waited. What does Minjai need Amara to know? And will she stay when she finds out? Leave a comment telling us what you think his secret is, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.